our one-on-one with H1 webinar series. Today we're talking about breaking through the noise, surfacing and tiering impactful KOLs. So if you're not familiar, let me tell you a little bit about H1. We are connecting the world to the right doctors as a leading source of truth for global, clinical, and scientific information. And we're so thrilled to have our customer, Baker Tilly, here with us today. So let me tell you what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about how to recognize specific KOLs with a unique background or niche that can have a greater impact. We're going to discuss how to source, identify, and potentially engage with the most appropriate KOLs, and also some regulatory and compliance considerations for HCP engagement. So with that, I'm going to kick it off, and I'm going to start with Nayanika Banerjee. She is with H1. She's the Senior Manager of Strategic Insights, and she is going to talk a little bit about data-driven strategies and best practices and her work with our clients. Nayanika, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do at H1?
Sure. Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. So my name is Nayanika. As Elizabeth mentioned, I sit on the Strategic Insights team. So what my team does is we're an extension, basically, of all the cool data and the platforms we have, right? So what that means is we work directly with our clients to understand their specific business needs, their strategies, and really make sure they're getting the right insights, right, from this data. So that could be anything from, med affairs, commercial, clinical teams, specific projects, or their overall engagement strategy, providing them with those insights, be it through, deliverables in formats or in terms of data, which really helps them guide and really make data-driven business decisions. Grace, do you want to go next?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to introduce myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Macalino. I'm an epidemiologist by training. I got my PhD at Hopkins, and I'm a director at Baker Tilly. And the work we do is support medical affairs and the scientific ecosystem at life sciences broadly to help with evidence generation. And we engage with KOLs in a very particular way, and we're really thoughtful about the kinds of perspectives of KOLs that are really valuable at different stages and the kind of work that is being done in clinical development, medical affairs, commercial access, market access. So you can already hear like different kinds of things are important for the different needs that you might have for a KOL at different stages.
Awesome. And last but not least, Samantha.
Good. Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Sutherland. I am a director with our compliance and ethics team at Baker Tilly. I'm very involved in anything that involves HCP interactions from a compliance standpoint. So frequently partnering with our medical and commercial functions to help them implement an HCP interaction process that goes all the way from initial sourcing, identification, all the way through contract payment. So here to add a little bit perspective on the compliance elements that are sort of embedded in all of these types of activities.
Awesome. Thank you. And just a few housekeeping items. We are going to limit questions until the end just so we don't interrupt the panel. So feel free to type your questions. If we don't get to them by the end of the event, we will definitely follow up with you afterwards. And there will be a recording and a follow-up email available after the event. All right. So when we think about KOL identification and a larger organizational HCP engagement strategy, what are some of the best practices for identifying the KOLs really with specificity or experience, but also maybe at the primary or secondary level for a very specific indication, which is kind of how things are leaning now? What do you think, Nayanika? We'll kick it off to you.
Sure. I can start. And this one's a loaded question, right? I mean,
right.
You can come from so many different ways. And I think, Sam and Grace, I'd love to hear your perspectives in the end. But I'll just highlight maybe 4 or 5 really key and basic, right, best practices when you're thinking about, KOL engagement, your overall engagement strategy. I think the first one's super basic, right? But having clear selection criteria. And you'd be surprised how often, and I have clients who, we ask them, tell me about your strategy or how you built your list. And often, we hear, these were lists given to us by our field teams. They have relationships with these KOLs. And while that's great, that's awesome, it's a good qualitative layer to have. I think it's super important to have very clear selection criteria, which really help you justify why you chose to engage with a particular KOL or expert, and how you're defining them, again, to, as stated in the question, specific to your indication. In addition to that, I think aligning those selection criteria, right, to very specific business needs or purposes. And that honestly to me is like, it should be at the core, right, of your strategy, which is not just having clear criteria, but also making sure, you can again justify a very specific need that that particular KOL or that relationship is addressing. And that could be, for example, you're planning for research, right, or a particular ad board, which addresses a very specific topic, right? So not just having a KOL be an expert in a space, but being able to justify, hey, we're talking about, say, osteoporosis as a side effect of your drug, looking for those niche and specific, data points to really make sure you're addressing that core need. So that's super important. And then also, I think, lastly, having a selection criteria, aligning it to your business need, but also keeping your search objective, right? And that's where I think having, a bunch of different data points in one place comes super handy, because then you're kind of letting data lead the way, right? And by being objective, I also think it helps because you're not being led by what you may already know, right, or relationships you may already have, but you're going to be able to identify maybe trends or, shifting interests amongst HCPs, which happens often, right? We saw that with the pandemic, in the infectious disease space, so many people, kind of were probably more HIV or whatever, and then shifted to COVID, and maybe they're going back and maybe not. So just as an example, being open and being objective really helps you, track and get ahead of the curve in terms of some of these trends. And then just maybe the last one, super important, again, documentation. Very basic, but I think a key best practice, which again, very often we don't see, especially happening effectively, right? So when I say documentation, again, just having a KOL list isn't enough. Being able to document every step of the way, right? How you screen them, when you screen them, what benchmark were used, what time frames, right, were in place. And then also, I think, right till the end, right? Tracking your engagement. So again, that's where I know the way we do it at H1 and platforms like ours is right from the beginning, having those insights in terms of why you selected them, when you're sharing them with your MSLs, them tracking if they engaged successfully or who they engaged with. And then in the end, what happened as a result of that engagement, what particular business need did that meet. So I think having all of that in one place and documenting that is super important, not just for yourselves, I think internally as teams, right, for our clients, but also for us or any outside third party you may be working or partnering with, to help understand your strategy and accordingly refresh or enhance it, which also I think is probably one of my last points I'll make here, which is one of the best practices is, I think, refreshing your lists, right? And keeping them updated. Again, 5 years back, we get lists which are like dated out, which is fine, sure, but you have to be open to, a lot of these shifting dynamics, new and up and coming experts coming up. So that was a lot, but those I think are some of the core best practices you should consider. Sam, Grace, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on this, Nayonika, but one best practice I would highlight is your annual KOL planning exercise. So this is where I see a lot of companies struggle because from a compliance standpoint, it's kind of the industry norm to put an annual cap on the total amount of consulting payments for any one KOL, usually around 100,000 USD is what I see in the US. And so you want to make sure you go through a rigorous annual planning exercise, because there's instances that I know of from some of our clients where, medical has like a very specific need advisory board topic, and they'd like to engage with a certain KOL, but the commercial team or, the R&D team has used them and actually hit up to that cap, and so they're not available. So I would just highlight best practices for identifying KOLs is having that annual KOL planning exercise. And the way that I've seen companies set this up really nice is having a cross-functional committee, maybe meet once a quarter, and have that comprehensive needs assessment as much as you possibly can. I know that's saying something like, planning is everything, but plans are nothing because the world changes so quickly. But, it's an exercise worth doing. So I would just add that. And then, of course, as a compliance professional, I would be remiss if I did not also highlight the documentation portion. So making sure that you have that business needs assessment form completed, with the justification, the business rationale for engaging with this KOL. So that, you're not violating any kind of anti-bribery, anti-corruption practices across the globe.
Great insight. Grace, anything
Great.
to add?
And I just agree with all of that. The one thing I would just add perhaps is, really bringing home this idea of best practices and identifying the right KOLs, right? They're not an unlimited resource. And the idea that, there are specific insights and expertise that you'd like to glean from them, understanding, like, especially in rare diseases or when, KOLs are in short number, getting really savvy and thoughtful about who and what information you'd like to get from specific people is super, super valuable. So that's just a sort of color to what Nyanika and Sam had mentioned so far, as opposed to anything new perhaps. But I think that it's really important to remember, there's really great information we're trying to gather from these KOLs, and being very strategic and specific and clear about what we want from each one of them, I think, is super important.
I love that point about it's not an unlimited resource. It's a great point. So when we think about how is KOL identification and sourcing, how is identification and sourcing, how are those two different things? So do you know if you have the right universe of KOLs, and how do you know? Sam, can we start with you?
Yeah, and I love this question because this has come up recently in a little bit of my work. So there's not only wonderful, awesome databases like the H1 database for prescriber KOLs. There's actually companies out there that have similar databases for patients and caregivers. And so this question about, how are, from a compliance standpoint, you want to make sure you're understanding, how are these companies that have these potential external consultants for you to engage with sourcing these individuals, particularly with patients. You want to make sure that obviously any kind of, patient advocacy groups that might be providing data have received patient consent to do so, as an example. So the sourcing is very important from a compliance perspective. Also, you want to make sure that you have an entire universe that captures all of the relevant, applicable individuals for each specific need, as Grace has kind of touched on. So it is very important to understand the difference between KOL sourcing and KOL identification, and really get into the nitty-gritty details of how is the database of KOLs being compiled. Grace and Nyanika, I know you guys have much more to add on this topic from that medical perspective.
Nyanika, do you want to add some
Sure.
color?
Sure. And as I'm thinking of this question, I feel like there's probably different ways to look at it. But I think for me, the key difference is I think sourcing is slightly more broad compared to identification. And then what that means is, as Sam was saying, at least for platforms like ours, I think one of the first questions we get asked or we like to address is, where are you getting this data from, right? And to Sam's point, I think that's an important question to discuss, because you want to know, what kind of trial sources, are we using, right? Even something as basic as which therapeutic areas based on your indication are you looking at, because as we know, some diseases are complex, right? Could they include, you just need gastros, right? Do you also need general physicians? Do you need, things like that? So I think sourcing becomes important, because that is going to decide, right, the type of experts you're going to be able to surface. And then when I meant identification is more specific. So I would say for sourcing, you want to go broad so that you have all your options, right? You have this database which will help you, address multiple different needs. Whereas identification, as we went over it in the previous question, needs to be a lot more nuanced and specific in terms of identifying, right, particular KOLs for specific business needs. So I think to me, that would be the key difference. And in terms of, do you have the right universe? I mean, that's the golden question. You want to keep asking that, right? And I think the best way, I think the answer depends on a lot of different things, but most importantly, a lot of those results, like track your results, see if it's effective. Again, this is complex, right? So I think the biggest thing to address this question is if you have the right universe or not, is to have a clear idea of where you started, what was the need, and what was the end result of these engagements.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing. I mean, I think the challenge, or sort of maybe the fun game of KOL identification, is really almost pushing beyond your comfort zone, right? So folks, a lot of times companies have their go-to, they know, everyone knows about the leaders in a field, but depending on the information you're trying to gather, really getting new insights and understanding exactly sort of what haven't we thought about yet is what's most valuable. So really being able to sort of expand that list or the potential folks that you can include in those conversations is very, very important, right? And not being willing to kind of just go to your go-to people immediately, and really be thoughtful and think outside of the box. I remember as HIV prevention was moving into prevention and PrEP, right? All of a sudden, it wasn't the world of ID docs any longer. You were really talking about primary care docs, because that's where folks were being treated. And it just opened up a whole bunch of wow, we don't even know how they think, what that looks like, and just different perspectives that need to be included in the way you think about, again, the unique needs and insights that you're looking for from KOLs.
Sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? As far as that universe.
100%. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
So,
actually
oh, go ahead, Nyanika. You have something to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying that's actually a great point, Grace. And also, talking about going, thinking outside the box, but also to me, I always say looking beyond the data, because sometimes, when you're looking at data, it only gets you so far. So something I always like to say is think of these HCPs or experts beyond just these data points, as humans, as, not just profiles, because when you engage with them, again, that's where you really find out if that person's the right KOL. So it's kind of that balance between data, but also that actual, person and how they are. So I think that piece is also super important.
That's great. When we think about the listening and the new universe, and we think about the digital universe, right? That's kind of the new, I wouldn't say newish frontier, because everybody's talking about DOLs now, especially since COVID. So how do you begin building a digital engagement leader specific strategy where you make sure you're encapsulating those digital voices in the leadership of the therapeutic areas, but also finding those rising stars that are just kind of finding their way to be KOLs? I think we'll start with Grace.
So this is such an interesting, I love this question, because, I think as a field, we're not, it's kind of new to us to think about the sort of digital engagement leaders. I know lots and lots of KOLs that, don't even have social media, experience or exposure at all. So this feels still very new in our world. Wait, what do you mean? Digital engagement leaders or digital opinion leaders, and sort of adding a whole other category of both expanding knowledge about this to real, I think COVID and over time, we've really seen, where it's valuable to sort of get ahead of the conversations or really understand what folks are saying out there, because folks are obviously listening, right? So I think, sorry, I thought it was important just to level set there, because, digital opinion leaders as a concept is still definitely not just relatively new broadly, but I think in the industry is really something that we've found at times we've had to even educate folks in terms of what does that mean, right? So I think, so first, an understanding that they are important to consider and include in the KOL sort of needs, sort of the information that you'd like to collect from folks, as far as, what is that finger on the pulse? What are folks talking about? What are folks listening to? How are they relating to a particular disease, symptoms, or what it looks like, patients, kind of just getting that lay of the land, I think is super important. So I think in terms of building a strategy, it's both understanding that they exist and really sort of paying attention to, and I'll sort of leave the details to Nyanika and Sam as well. But, how do you access and identify those thought leaders that are really impacting the current state of affairs in a particular disease?
That's great. Sam?
Yeah, I also love this question, and I have so much to say. Engaging with DOLs, social media influencers, HCP influencers, all the terms that are kind of interchangeable at this point within the industry has so many compliance related implications. I mean, in some countries globally, you're not really, they're not allowed to be compensated for social media activity. So, level setting, you need to make sure that whatever jurisdiction you're operating within, it's an allowable activity to engage with a digital engagement leader. But if you are going to engage with them, I see a lot of clients doing this through an independent third party, like a media agency, as a way to insert sort of separation and a level of independence in these digital leader interactions. There are some downsides to that. Media agencies, are not well versed in life sciences compliance and ethics and regulations. So there have been some instances where a client of mine, for example, had a media agency offer their standard, payment amount across industries to an individual, and it was higher than the FMV. And so they had to walk back that payment and jeopardize that relationship with the digital engagement leader. So something to think about if you are going to be engaging with third parties to manage these interactions. Also, these third parties can use approved responses that go through your promotional review committee, your medical legal review committee. So they can actually manage if someone makes a post on behalf of your company, any responses, they can monitor for those adverse events, product quality complaints, and then also actually respond to the commenters with approved language. So that's another really good kind of compliance way that these types of interactions are being managed. And then the last comment I would make is around fair market value. So in engaging with a digital engagement leader, your standard hourly FMV rate card that you have implemented is not going to be applied very well to a digital engagement. And the reason is that there is a large intangible value with digital engagement, with the network that individual has built up, posts over time, the robustness of their profile on whatever platform it is, LinkedIn, Facebook, et cetera. So just thinking about FMV in a different way for digital engagements as well as another consideration. And then the last comment I'll make is also thinking about the platforms for which these digital engagement leaders are posting on. So I know a lot of companies don't even allow posting on TikTok, for example, because I didn't know this personally. I actually found this out when I was speaking at a conference a few months ago, that TikTok in their legal language, they are allowed to change your post after you make it. So them having that ability, a lot of clients are uncomfortable with that and don't want to take the risk that there's a change made that's completely inappropriate. And so they don't even post on that platform. So lots and lots and lots to think about compliance wise with these digital engagement leader interactions.
That's so interesting, because you're hearing people get information now from TikTok, right? That's not new any longer. So interesting.
Right. So Nyonika, I know our customers ask this a lot of the solutions insights team about how do we find DOLs? What is your typical approach?
Yeah, good question. So before we do a lot of this. There's so much you can do. We're still trying to figure out, new ways, because I always say the Twitterverse, the internet, the digital world, there's so much data, but also there's so much noise. So that's always our biggest struggle, is truly getting meaningful insights. I will say one thing. I mean, when we talk about digital, a lot of other companies take a more broad approach, right? They're doing listening and sentiment analysis and all that stuff, also including like patients, etc., which is, I think, a part of a lot of our client strategies. But our platform, given it is more HCP driven, I think that already takes away a little bit of noise, because our approach is very much around, digital, but it's going to be opinions of, true healthcare professionals, which are actually going to help guide your medical strategy and things like that. So truly digital opinion leaders from an HCP perspective, right? Versus nowadays we have a lot of patient DOLs and influencers also coming up. Now, before I go into how, I do want to say, I think, both Grace and Sam covered the two basic pillars. I think the first step to how is even acknowledging, right, to Grace's point, because this is so new to the industry. I mean, I know a lot of my clients, we work with them to even start from scratch, right? With clients tell us initially, at least about a year ago, that we don't have a digital strategy. You help us build it. And the first thing that we did was help them define, and to Sam's point too, even compliance-wise, a lot of these companies didn't have a very clear idea of how to engage with them, or what are some of these criteria that will help you, justify FMV and things like that, what should be on the business needs forms, things like that. So I definitely think we've come a long way. So that's good, because now I'm seeing a lot of clients actually have a policy in place and have a rough idea, right, of what they think is a DOL and things like that. So I think both of those points were super important. But to your point, Elizabeth, the way we approach it is, I think, again, I always say these experts, HCPs, they wear different hats. It's like a puzzle. So I think the one thing I say is it's not like these DOLs are like new unicorns. A lot of them might have some overlap with KOLs, right? So that's the first step. Amongst your universe, try and see how many of them are, open to being more or are digitally more savvy. They're on multiple platforms, and that already helps you, I think, engage with them in a more meaningful way. Because one thing, again, this happened with me when I used to be in the field. I remember, some experts, like, they're so digitally savvy, like they almost get annoyed now if you give them those paper journals and things like that, right? And then there's also the opposite, where sometimes they're not digitally, as Grace was saying, they're not even on these platforms. So with them, you need to be sensitive, and you need to know even, and that's a part of your planning, if you're in the field, which is this person going to be likely to adopt these digital means versus not, right? So I think that's a good first step too, which is amongst your universe, try and see who is potentially a DOL or who has the scope to build, into a DOL by partnering with you. And then the other approach is obviously, again, there are a lot of these new up and coming, kind of relatively younger, newer experts on the horizon, right? Uncut gems, emerging experts, rising stars. And very often we do this analysis for clients, where you see within your strategy where these DOLs fall. And I'll tell you, mostly they are your tier 2s or tier 3s, right? And how that helps is now you can engage with them differently. They might not be your tier 1 KOL, right? So you might not be engaging with them in a certain way. But now that you know that this person might be a tier 3, but like they have tons of followers, right? They're posting a bunch. That's someone you want to engage with if you're trying to, get out the word about like a new study result or something like that. The other thing we do is characterize DOLs, and that's super, super interesting, actually. We do like cool matrices of sorts, and we try to cross-reference not just digital scores or metrics, but compare it or put it in reference to their scientific expertise, right? So what that does is, and very often we see this, so you almost can map out these experts on like a matrix, which tells you who is more of like, you can give them creative names, who's more like a social scientist, right?
Right.
So they're more socially super active, they're doing a lot of research, but they might not be your top KOL, who might be more of a silent scholar, right? Things like that. So it's very interesting when you put your true medical excellence or KOL perspective against the digital perspective, right? That I think really helps you characterize them and helps you, engage with them again in different ways depending on your business need. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I promise I'll shut up, which is
This is fantastic.
the other thing we do a bunch for clients, and I started with this, was actually analyzing what they're talking about, right? Because when you're talking about DOLs, again, there's so much out there. They're putting so much out there, all these opinions, screening what's relevant, but also looking for, scientific share of voice, things like that. How much they may be talking about you or your product, right? versus a competitor's. And that also often helps with a lot of, impact assessment, right? Are your engagements truly, being fruitful in terms of, are they talking about you more in a good way or in a neutral way or in a negative way, etc. So there's a lot of ways you can actually analyze their content in the social world, which I think is giving clients a lot of meaningful information, but you've got to be careful, again, because of the noise in this space. So those are a few different ways how we've kind of helped build digital strategies.
Neon, I actually have a follow-up question for you, if you're comfortable sharing. With the up-and-comers, I'm really curious because our team has had just theoretical discussions about this a lot. You're right that they're mostly going to be your tier 2 and tier 3s. How do you guys identify those people? Because we've kind of talked just internally with our team about, looking at category 1 institutions that a tier 2 or 3 might work at, a certain count of publications within the last 2 years since they graduated residency. Like how do you guys isolate those people, if you don't mind sharing?
No, good question. I mean, rising stars, again, they're so important to pharma now. I feel like all our clients are like, we know our KOLs now, help us find the up and coming experts. So we get this a lot. I think a few different ways is that I think the waterfall effect, as I like to call it, is super fun, right? Because what happens is a lot of these rising stars are doing research with or under a lot of your tier 1, right? Those ivory tower KOLs. How you can identify them different ways, we get creative sometimes, be it authorship, right? First, last authors. The actually figuring out that date is very important, right? Because we don't always know exactly when they graduated. So using a little bit of maybe their first publication dates. When did they start publishing? Is that within the last 5 or 10 years? That is kind of an assumption of how long they've been in the industry. So just, using creative data points like that. The other thing I like to look at is straight up, just benchmarks, like tweaking, as you said, right? If someone has hundreds of pubs on, in whatever, lung cancer, for example, versus someone who's more up and coming, obviously they're going to have fewer. But, again, looking at who they've collaborated with, how far back do those go, right? Obviously having in our platform, and pulling in their pictures is super helpful sometimes, right? Because sometimes even having a look at them, you can tell if that's more of a up and coming, right, rising star versus not. Let me see if I missed something. Yeah, even in terms of trials and stuff, right? When we look at these profiles and multiple data points in one place, that kind of helps really gauge, right, if they're more of a rising star versus more of an established. But I hope those handful, I think 2 or 3 data points I mentioned, those kind of help guide a little of the criteria that we use for rising stars.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
That's great insight. So it sounds like we've covered, there's got to be a good strategy. There's got to be specificity. And now let's see how we're going to wrap it up. So the way you source your KOLs will impact how you execute on that strategy. So we've talked about some data points, Nyanika, you just mentioned. Any new and creative data-driven ways you've seen industry or customers do this really well?
Is that for me?
Oh, sorry, Nyanika, do you want to kick it off? Yeah.
Sure. So I think, we spoke about sourcing KOLs a little bit, right? But as I said, that's key. You want to, because, as I said, oftentimes you're even using the wrong data set, and by wrong, maybe it's limited, or maybe you're just looking at one therapeutic area, right? Versus being more broad. So sourcing is definitely key, but also I think in terms of executing your strategy, I mean, I keep saying it, but to me, I've worked in this space in terms of, pharma, there's so much data out there, be it compliance, be it medical strategy, be it just general HCP information. So I think the best way is finding platforms or finding ways to connect the dots. And sometimes
synthesize it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That answers so many questions. And that's honestly my personal favorite thing about each one, because, when you're just looking at publication, when you're just looking at trials, it just gives you one perspective, right? And as we know, medical strategy is complicated and you need to have multiple perspectives because a lot of these experts are, as I keep saying, wearing different hats. You won't believe it. There are people who are doing hundreds of pubs and somehow they're tweeting a bunch and somehow, they're doing trials as well. Obviously, maybe not all of it at the same rate, but But you need to, again, if you don't have all these data points in one place, I think that's often as simple, but that's often the issue, right? So that to me is like solves most of the problems at once, which is just having a clear picture and connecting the dots.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you said, Nayonika, and echo just making sure that you cast that really wide net initially, which is going to impact how well you can execute any kind of KOL strategy. I think we've hammered that home a few times, but really that is like the key to one of the keys to a successful KOL strategy execution for sure. I think also, making sure you use all of the available information to you, which Nayonika also just highlighted. So as a customer of H1, I know they have all these wonderful features. So, making sure that you check out the network of KOLs that are attached to each other, making sure that all of those individuals are included in your universe of potential KOLs for interactions and engagements. Also using subspecialization search terms. So always making sure, like, really getting into that niche area if it's something that's not captured at the board certification, specialty exam, fellowship level, really making sure that those individuals are also included in your universe of potential KOLs, I think is really important. And then something we touched on it with the first question, having really clear, succinct initial selection criteria for your KOLs. Don't go overboard. I've seen companies create really robust initial selection criteria that was just too cumbersome. So you want to make sure that it is succinct and clear, but obviously is the initial vetting point, right, for the KOLs that you actually want to reach out to and potentially engage with.
That's awesome. Grace, any closing thoughts?
No, I agree with all of that. I mean, I think just, remembering that KOLs are complex and bring a lot of expertise. So it's as important that in your strategy, you just what's the information you're looking to gather from them, right? What are the insights that would be most valuable? Because then, having a complete list, being creative, you're trying to get to insights that, really at the very cutting edge of the information you're trying to get at. Maybe you can sort of loosen your idea of the kinds of people you need to talk to, right? It's not just in one specialty, perhaps, or one subspecialty might almost be too small, kind of broadening that definition might make sense depending on the questions you're looking to gain insights on. So yeah. All very, very valuable.
That's great. Well, this has been a very informational event. We want to thank Baker Tilly and Samantha and Grace for your time and for joining us. And Nayonika, thank you for your time. This was great insight. Again, the recording will be available via email after the event. If we didn't get to a question because of the panel, please feel free to email us at the email address below, and we'll be happy to answer your question after the event. We hope everyone has a great week, and thank you for joining us on One-on-One with H1. Have a great day.